No one is interested in work, and everyone, even in the lowest classes, wants to live in luxury. This cannot last. Money is getting scarcer and scarcer. Wealth consists in paper money, houses, slaves and furnitures, and frivolous French finery among the women. So, have you ever tried researching pre-colonial African fashion and gotten so frustrated at the lack of accessible resources that you just start looking up general historical fashion in Southern Africa? And then you discover that pretty dresses and cute hats were agents of colonialism and imperialism. And then you spend 10 hours recording and editing a video about it before your computer crashes and you return to the bad place. But you've spent so much time basically discovering what an episode of Gossip Girl would have been like if it was set in the Dutch Cape Colony, that you just have to keep going, because if there's one thing you're always going to do, it's assault strangers on the internet with 3,365 words that absolutely no one asked for. Yeah, me too. If you live in South Africa, you just have to look outside to see how profitable colonialism was. But like, even with a basic understanding, nothing really prepared me for learning that something as seemingly innocuous as the fashion of rich white women in the 1700s would have such a profound legacy in building this here, us, one of the most unequal societies in the modern world. I guess it's like an editor's note. When I first made this video, my plan was to create a sketch of what these women would have been wearing at the time, just because there isn't a lot of visual evidence, and I didn't want this video to just be me talking. But I have since lost those files, and maybe that's where you can tell my irritability is coming from. So I think just treat this like a podcast. Maybe right now is like a good time to do the dishes or something. You know how today, in the year of our Lord 2023, Cape Town somewhat jokingly, somewhat accurately described as a piece of Europe inside of Africa? Yeah, that reputation isn't new, and more importantly, it's 100% not by accident. In the 18th century, Cape Town had such a luxury and elegance to living that it was even dubbed Little Paris for a time. The Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, built such a thriving colony that it even rivaled some of the richest cities in the West. And this was during peak let them eat cake teas, by the way. Beyond fertile soil, a never-ending influx of trade ships, agreeable weather, and a so-called empty land just waiting for domination, Cape society was exactly what you'd expect from an episode of Bridgerton. I'm talking balls and dances held at least once a week, extravagant ball gowns and expensive jewelry, and most critically, vicious social climbing, to such an extent that in 1755, Governor Ryk Tulbaugh had to install sumptuary laws to remind people of their place. And sumptuary laws are basically just the fashion police, legally enforced rules regulating what people get to wear according to their social class. Royalty and nobility historically would claim moral and religious grounds in order to keep the lower classes not only from just looking like them, but also, really importantly, possibly looking better than them. And you might, I guess, be wondering like who these sumptuary laws were for. So in the 1700s, Cape society, high society at least, was divided into two factions: the VOC elite and the free burgher elite. The VOC elite were the high-ranking officials of the VOC who would have been high-status individuals from Holland stationed in the colony to maximize profits for the company. The burghers, on the other hand, were often low-ranking, lower-class citizens who arrived in Cape Town to do all the dirty work that went into all of that profit maximization. See, the VOC didn't really intend for Cape Town to be much more than a really swanky pit stop in between the East and West. In fact, they didn't really even intend for there to be a Cape Town. Hello, there was all of this free land, a bunch of free slave labor, and direct access to the center of one of the world's most sophisticated trade networks. Oh my god, trade networks. I don't know why I couldn't say that. So it's like, what are you gonna do? Not manifest destiny? Not lay your claim? Not get dumb, stupid rich? And the free burghers were basically Cape Town's first permanent European settlers. You see, most of the VOC officials had planned to retire to Holland or one of its beautiful colonies after completing their services. But the burghers elected to purchase land and branch out beyond the pit stop to establish farms, housing projects, and businesses. So that within the 50 years following Jan van Riebeeck's arrival in 1652, taverns, hotels, wineries, storefronts culminated in a Rococo fever dream of excess and glamour. And this was like really upsetting for the VOC elite. The orphans, tradesmen, and laborers that they had themselves had practically begged to come to the colony to build their houses and outnumber the annoying Khoikhoi population were starting to infringe on their God-given right to be better than everyone else. So it's also probably significant to note somewhere here that Dutch society at this time was kind of defined by its ability to build barriers. It's kind of like why they have so many canals and like crazy water networks. To be Dutch was to separate yourself. The world was just heathens and those destined for heaven, and you could only be the latter if you were wealthy, Christian, and of course Dutch, and yeah, also white. That said, there was a slight progressive nature to their society. It obviously goes without saying that women's rights weren't really super hot in the 1700s, but Dutch women were allowed a certain degree of agency and ownership over their own possessions. In fact, one of the most prominent Cape figures of this time was a business woman, which, you know, like not a widely accepted concept at the time. And we'll talk about her a little later when I remember that this video is supposed to be about clothes. In Batavia, another Dutch colony in this time that is now present-day Jakarta, Indonesia, even Asian women could achieve Dutch citizenship and status through marriage. And that kind of miscegenation isn't really something you see common historically. And consequently, this was also the other Dutch colony that was subject to sumptuary laws. And why? Batavia was pretty similar to the Cape in that setting up an empire became a really big business for a class of people who were never meant to be rich. But it also put Dutch people in direct and frequent contact, mind you, with outsiders, the people of color who challenged their domination, who said, hey, like, stop trying to colonize my land. So the VOC elite had like ups in two corners. They were the natives who just didn't feel like being disenfranchised today, and social climbers who threatened the social status quo by establishing a society outside of traditional Dutch stratification and order. And what's funny is that the latter was kind of really their own doing, like they made the thing that destroyed them. A key facet of Calvinism, which would have been the guiding religious philosophy, is this idea that God wants you to be rich. To go out and make money is your moral duty, it's your moral privilege. And in order to build a society where you can enslave and dispossess people, you do have to go out of your way to confirm and maintain your authority, your superiority. So it is partly essential that the free burghers fulfill this moral duty. And fashion became the tool with which settler women created and maintained the social order. O.F. Menzel, in his writings about the colony in the 1700s, asserted, money, not pedigree, is worshipped at the Cape. And it's kind of ironic that most Christian ideology sees greed as sinful, but also promotes this manifest destiny, earn for Jesus mentality. Maybe not ironic, just kind of funny, ha ha. In A Theory of a Leisure Class, Thorstein Veblen explains that conspicuous consumption arises because private wealth can't be seen. Like, no one can know about the money in your bank account or under your mattress. So to prove your economic standing and also fit in with the people in your class, you have to engage in outward, ostentatious spending. And I think this is where I bring this all back to clothes. Because wealth can't be seen, the elite classes have to engage in fashioning the body in order to visually communicate status, hierarchy, heritage, and importance. And for the men making dumb, stupid money in the 1700s, their wives and daughters were the medium for this. Thus, the role of elite women in society was to keep this conversation going. And no one talked more than the women of the VOC and the burgher elite. Being in Cape Town put these women in a really advantageous position to be incredibly fashionable and trendy for this time. They could intercept the finest silks and cottons from the East while subscribing to the latest fashion trends according to the fashion plates and fashion magazines from the West. Lavalin writes in 1790 that he was surprised to see that the women dressed and adorn themselves with the same fastidious elegance as our French ladies, but they have neither their style nor their graces. Which, okay, don't drag them too hard. The unfortunate thing for the elite classes is that while their lowers couldn't imitate their breeding manners or like aristocratic bloodlines, they could definitely buy the same outfits. Especially in a society with so much room for social mobility. That's why sumptuary laws were so important to continuing this really rigid, strict pecking order. In the Cape Colony, the officials and the families of the VOC sat on the highest rung of the socio-economic ladder. Think of them as your Blairs and Serenas, followed by the burgher elite, who were businesswomen and landowners, you know, the new money. So your Jennies and your Jennies. Then the poor burghers were primarily farm laborers and working class individuals, and below them were European immigrants, soldiers and sailors, then followed by free blacks, which is a little bit of a confusing term because it describes people of whole or part Asian and African descent who were manumitted from slavery, and then below them were enslaved people, and then finally the Khoikhoi, you know, the people who actually were there. By the way, also enslaved people in this context refers to Asian and Africans brought to the Cape, not necessarily those found in the Cape or in surrounding areas. And these were often people from Angola, Mozambique, Malaysia, India, and so on. And the Khoikhoi weren't technically allowed to be enslaved because the VOC wanted to maintain their social relations with them, since they really heavily relied on them for understanding and also laboring the land in the region. But honestly, there wasn't anything about the way the Khoi were treated that wasn't basically slavery. I guess we could call it serfdom, which maybe is kind of worse because you get all the benefits of slavery and you have to pay rent. Yet, even within the company itself, status wasn't as guaranteed or as clear as just being an officer or the daughter or the wife of an officer. Rank and position were consequential considerations that weren't just the result of your economic and political activity, but they were impacted, influenced, and implied through ethnicity, facial features, language, religion, etiquette, and most obviously dress. And out of all of these factors, dress is obviously the easiest to replicate. Like I said, you might not be able to fake manners and breeding, but you can definitely just buy the right outfit. And part of being rich is just looking rich. You know, like officials of high rank and position within the company, such as senior merchants, could be recognized by the fact that they were allowed to wear silk velvet clothing. And the junior merchants below them were allotted gold or silver shoe buckles, whereas other lower class people weren't or wouldn't maybe have access to that. And according to the 1755 Sumptuary Laws, any woman below the wives of junior merchants was forbidden from wearing silk dresses with silk braiding or embroidering, nor any diamonds nor mantelets, which are just like little cloaks. And there are even a few records of what these women were wearing in this time from inventories collected following their deaths. The first is found in the inventory of Anna Fothergill Swellingrebel, who was known as the Second Lady of the Cape. Upon her death in 1764 were 35 sac dresses or robe à la française, which by the way, huge amount, and 3 silk aprons, 16 pairs of cotton stockings, 67 handkerchiefs, 8 lace caps, 3 bonnets, and several fans and capes. Wilhelmina de Witt was a Dutch-born orphan who came to enjoy upward class mobility once she married a really wealthy man in the Cape, a trajectory highly unlikely had she stayed in Holland. In the inventory collected following her death in the early 1700s were 30 chintz dresses, 2 wool dresses, 7 silk dresses, 3 silk handkerchiefs, 90 linen handkerchiefs, 39 caps, and 6 pairs of gloves. The businesswoman I mentioned earlier was Josina van Dam. Her inventory included a staggering 41 dresses, 11 pairs of silk gloves, and an expansive collection of gold, pearl, and diamond jewelry. And from their wardrobes, you wouldn't really be able to tell who made up VOC elite, being Anna Vathagral Swellingrubble, and burgher elite, which would have been Josina van Dam and Wilhelmina de Witt. You know, it was kind of, from their collections, it at least sounds on paper identical, though perhaps this might have played out different in real life. But I think you can always imagine that if you had to put these women in a room, you really wouldn't have a guaranteed way of knowing who was higher in status unless you actually spoken to them. A Moravian missionary writes of the colony in 1793, "The pride of the woman here is astonishing. They are farmers' daughters, but I have seldom seen a lady in Germany walk about more elegantly dressed and with headgear more grand." Now to the modern ear, 41 dresses or 6 pairs of gloves probably doesn't sound like much, but in a time where almost everything was laboriously handmade, it wasn't common for the average person like you and me to even own a quarter of what I've listed, especially when you remember that fashions at this time were broadly more intricate and labor intensive than our modern fashions, even though they're bolstered by so much technology. But unlike today, textiles were incredibly expensive and incredibly valuable, and this lasted pretty much up until like the 20th century. And in the time before the Industrial Revolution, the majority of cloth was farmed, cultivated, carded, woven, felted, and knitted by hand. But ironically, just like today, labor was still really cheap. And prior to the Sumptuary Laws, the only limitation to extravagant and flamboyant dress would have been just a lack of resources and more so imagination. Most of the well-to-do households in the Cape Colony could have had anything from 5 to 20 enslaved people and servants in their employ, and many of these domestic workers would have been seamstresses. In fact, enslaved women from Bengal, Coromandel, India, and Madagascar were in high demand for their proficiency in sewing and embroidery and just general needle crafts. The historian Robert Shull states that on entering 18th century Cape homes, visitors were greeted by the sight of a long, broad gallery with 4 or 6 slave women sat on small wooden benches sewing and knitting. Mensel says of the enslaved women in the 1730s, "The slave women from Bengal, Surat, and other places can work and embroider most beautifully so long as the designs are provided for them. These slaves are for this reason very valuable, and a housewife who possesses any of them keeps them employed upon work of this kind the whole year."
Apparently slavery was pretty awesome.
Prove it.
What's to prove? It's free labor.
Not that, ass!
And even for those without this plethora of free labor, could also imitate the latest styles in their own homes. Again, the VOC's extensive trade network meant that access to magazines and fashion plates was plentiful, and several women in the Cape of all socioeconomic stations could recreate these looks if they just had the material or resources. John Barrow wrote of the Cape women in the 1790s, "They are expert at needle in all kinds of lace, knotting and tambour work, and in general make up their own dresses, following the prevailing fashions of England, brought from time to time by the female passengers bound to India." You know, there was a penalty of 25 Ryk for any woman married or single without distinction wearing dresses with a train, and even parasols like for sun protection, were so regulated that in a population of 12,000 Europeans in the colony, only 50 men and their wives were allowed to use one. But like, where did they go? Where were they going? Where was this for? Who were they showing out to? Well, wouldn't you like to know that Cape life, or at least Cape High society life, was characterized by a really busy and intense social calendar. I'd make some sort of throwaway comment about like the nightlife and social scene being comparable to present day Cape Town, but apparently everything's been dead since the pandemic. Point is, these people loved to party rock in the house tonight. The governor made sure to throw at least one ball a month, which became the site in which these women could one up and outdo each other in their elegant dresses and grand headgear. And the people of distinction quickly followed suit, throwing their own frequent balls and fancy dress gatherings. La Valente even claimed that the women at the Cape were mad about dancing, thus rarely a week passes without several balls taking place. According to Nigel Warden, New Year's Day was a particularly festive occasion, with the governor receiving the who's who's at the castles, and these occasions getting rather rowdy, with some reports of drunken attendees firing gunshots into the air at the climax of the party, which is just like it's so me coded. Like I'd totally be doing that if I was getting drunk off of liquor and being dumb rich in the 1800s or 1700s. Church was also another sphere in which the Cape elite had the opportunity to turn out looks, and even Sunday evenings were dedicated to dance parties where they could be entertained by ethnic music from enslaved Mozambicans in Malagasy. There were also weddings, birthdays, and just like elaborate dinner receptions and tea parties and social calling. Oh, and if you are at this point imagining that these soirees and fetes were like something out of a Jane Austen novel, then you're really not too far from the truth. Going back to a theory of a leisure class, Verlaine asserts that one of the defining characteristics of a leisure class is how it occupies itself not only with the accumulation of material possessions, but also the adoption of complex social interactions in lieu of having to work or, make a valuable contribution to the function of a civilization. Because like, what else are you going to do when you're getting rich off of other people's labor, if not make up these arbitrary rules about the right undergarments to wear to breakfast, or the order in which people in a room should greet each other, or who's allowed to have the longest train at a party? And going back to my little Jane Austen comment, we even have an anecdote of the breakdown of a lifelong friendship because of these arbitrary social rules and comedy of manners. From O.F. Menzel's writings, A and B were as girls the closest friends, more than sisters to each other. Both were daughters of under merchants, but A had social precedence over B because her father was senior in rank to B's father. Both married under merchants, but B's husband was senior in standing to A's. All at once, B's presence became hateful to A. Their long friendship was at an end. A avoided B whenever she could. She would not go to any function where B was expected. Nothing that B had done was responsible for this change in A's attitude. The fact was that by marriage, their social status had changed. B now had precedence over A because of her husband's rank, and A could not become reconciled with the change. Most ladies hold that A's conduct was right and proper, that there was no other way, but to me, it all just seems really petty, end quote. And okay, I guess this is the part where I wrap this up in a poetic little bow, right? Especially so that nobody accuses me of trying to glamorize Gossip Girl 18th century Cape Town. Okay, let's see. I don't know if there has to be some sort of grand takeaway from everything I've just said beyond, wow, that's really interesting. But maybe you can tell me something in the comments below. Like maybe you make the YouTube video this time. I guess I'll just ruminate on how these women held on so tightly to fashion as a tool for social distinction and maintaining social structure, because this was the only sphere in which they had any power and agency, at least in some sort of real way. And it's kind of funny because today we often see capital F fashion as this great liberator, a tool for self-expression, creative freedom, and culture and meaning, which yes, it is, but like it was also that in a more evil way for these women. It's just that their, self-expression, creative freedom, and cultural meaning was about protecting and establishing and maintaining and enforcing whiteness. And whiteness isn't something I could really consider real, because it's only defined by what it isn't. It can't exist without direct opposition. And its ability to erase nuance, idiosyncrasies, and natural change not only limits the people it oppresses, but the exact same people it's supposed to be upholding and empowering. And without trying to emphasize empathize too much with the rich white women whose family trees probably led to the architects of apartheid, I can't help but imagine how strange it is to be in a foreign land where you're expected to basically move mountains to make it look like your home. And no matter how much the earth fights you, no matter how much the ground shakes, no matter how many of you die in the process, you're told the only way to be home is to destroy someone else's. And that aside, I have also found some interesting papers and articles about the lives of free Black women in this time, which maybe I'll make a video about sometime soon, assuming my laptop doesn't crash again while I'm editing this. But I don't know, I can't really predict the future. It's why I spend all this time talking about the past. Comments again down below. Subscribe to my newsletter. Links in the description. All my sources are cited there. It's 8 o'clock. I've got to go.